occupying their estates. Okay, any questions? I've just realized that I've got to speed up, so. But if anyone has a question? No? Okay, so what's the politics of all of this? In many ways, what I've been talking about to you is this attempt to find a sort of new, stable vision of England, rooted in the home, rooted in the countryside. And this figure that you see before you, good old Stanley Baldwin, who becomes rather like, well, becomes the sort of Gladstone of his generation. You can see that, you know, between the 1920s and 1930s, he's barely out of the very highest offices in government. He was Prime Minister 3 times and Deputy Prime Minister in 1931 to 1935. What Baldwin does is very skillfully reinvent the Conservative Party. This is a party that had spent the previous 100 years, maybe 150 years, arguing ferociously that ordinary people like you and I should not have the vote. Okay? And now this party is operating in a completely different political context where everybody has the vote. Okay? So how does it make itself attractive to that very group of voters that it wished hadn't got the vote? And ironically, how it does it is to really make the Conservative Party like Gladstone's Liberal Party, to claim that they are almost the inheritors of that tradition, which is to say they present themselves as the defenders of constitutional liberty and of fiscal responsibility, of cheap government. Okay? And as you'll see next week, reducing the national debt that had come about from the loans taken out during the First World War, chiefly from the US, was a key element of their program, as was returning to the gold standard and to the era of free trade. Okay? Remember, the Conservative Party before the First World War, with Chamberlain around, had been edging towards protectionism, had been edging towards a system of imperial preference. But after the war, they see a return to the gold standard and to cheap government and to free trade as the central part of their political appeal. The other part was this defense of constitutional liberty. Okay? And what Baldwin and the Conservative Party did was present themselves as the upholders of a British constitutional tradition against what it portrayed as the threat of the organised labour movement, which was effectively represented as bordering on Bolshevism. And this appeal enabled the Conservative Party to reach out to members of the working class who were not members of the trade union, who were not trade union members. Remember, at this point, basically, about 70% of the population is working class. Okay, so you're not going to be able to get elected just by appealing to the aristocracy and to the middle class. You have to reach in to that working class base to get elected, and this is how they did it. This threat of Bolshevism was most famously articulated in the publication of a so-called letter, the Zinoviev letter, which tried to implicate that the Labour Party, this is during the election, that the Labour Party was under the control of under the control of Moscow. The general strike that broke out 2 years later, which I'll talk to you about more next week, seemed to indicate that the organised labour movement could hold, the unelected organised labour movement could hold the country to ransom. And so Baldwin said, look, who governs the country? This is going to be a very important theme in the 20th century in Britain. Who governs the country? Is it the elected government or is it the trade union movement? And so during the general strike, they call out for special constables to come and help man the buses. They put the armies on the street to try and defend the Constitution and defend the country. And they ask people to enlist as volunteers. And guess who enlists as a volunteer? My good old grandfather, who gets then this special commemorative note to say, thank you, to thank you for all those who come forward during the crisis and gave their services to their country as special constables to maintain order and freedom against the threat of the trade union movement. And indeed, Baldwin then becomes seen as this person who can manage these deep, dark crises of the 1920s and the 1930s. So first you have the general strike in 1926, then you have the big financial crisis of 1931, and finally the abdication crisis of 1936. And Baldwin's message and his appeal is basically safety first. You can trust me. I have experience of office. I can defend the Constitution and the economy from the ravages of the world. It's a highly successful strategy. It's the first time that the Conservative Party becomes a popular, a popular political party. Any questions on any of that? Yeah.
Wasn't Churchill Home Secretary at the time of the labor unrest?
Indeed. Churchill was indeed Home Secretary. It was Churchill who sent the army onto the streets during the general strike. And you're going to hear a little more about our friend Winston Churchill. And he also is the person who puts Britain back on the gold standard in 1924, which creates massive unemployment. And he also is the person who develops a interesting form of imperial policing that we're about to come on to. Any other questions? So I started this lecture saying that was this the moment where Britain turned away in this rush to try and embrace a new domestic tranquility and stability, whether it turned away from the empire and the sort of manly militarism that went with it. And obviously, territorially, that clearly isn't the case. After the Treaty of Versailles, Britain, as empire expands, as it fills in the slots of the old German colonies in East Africa and of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. So the very height of the British Empire is 1922. It covers 13 million square miles and a staggering 458 million people. Okay, so this is the high water mark of the British Empire. And yet, all is not well. Because the Great War had been an imperial war, because the British military depended utterly on its colonial troops in all three theatres of the war. So, just as the veterans in Britain expected to come home to a vote and a house fit for a hero, so colonial troops also expected that having done their duty and defended the British Empire, that they would now be ceded certain rights in return. Okay? And principally the right of citizenship. It's in that context of a new political energy around colonial nationalism, and the context of course, the demobilization of colonial troops, that 1919 becomes this year of massive unrest with those revolts that spread across the empire that I told you about at the beginning of the lecture. How then does Britain try and deal with this moment of crisis? Do they try and say, okay, this is the end, game is up, you've helped us out in the war, it's time for you to have self-government in stages, blah, 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 or is it time for the use of repression to say, no, we'll just try and knock the head off this movement and restore the discipline of the empire. And in fact, of course, what they do is both things at the same time. And I want to give you first the account of the use of repression. And I'm going to give you three contexts in which that happens: in Ireland, in India, and in Iraq. In Ireland, after the Rising, an election was held in 1918 as the same election that was held in Britain, except for this one was held in the Irish Parliament. And Sinn Féin, the chief party of the Nationalist Republican movement, won a majority of the seats in the Irish Parliament. They won 73 out of the 105 seats. It's a massive, massive victory. And the first thing that they do is declare Ireland a republic. We're the elected government of Ireland, we declare it a republic. Okay? Now, of course, the British were not having anything like that. That was not how it was meant to be. And because there was obviously no British withdrawal, so there begins an intensified military confrontation. The big Irish volunteer force that becomes the Irish Republican Army is launched, and the British government, and they begin these attacks on the Royal Irish Constabulary, which was the police force, the British police force. And in response, the British try and recruit, well, they don't try, they recruit a whole series of old veterans to join a new brigade known as the Black and Tans, because they wore khaki trousers and the black top of the Royal Irish Constabulary, because they didn't have enough trousers to go around for everybody. Something like 9,000 men joined the Black and Tans, and these are men who are returning back to Britain from the war, have no work, and many people have suggested are the men most brutalized by the experience of the war. Not the most brutalized, but these are men who really don't have a lot of options and have had a pretty ghastly time. They're certainly renowned for their complete lack of discipline, and they are renowned for their brutal violence to the civilian population, and particularly to reprisal attacks. So when the IRA attacked the RIC or the Black and Tans, the Black and Tans would go out and basically, do exemplary justice in the surrounding community. And a whole series of, small scale but important murders took place. And this war basically goes on from 1919 up through 1921.